The church bells were still ringing when I felt the floor collapse beneath me. It was my husband's funeral, a day already heavy with grief. But what happened inside that candlelit hall ripped open a wound far deeper than death itself. I stood there in my black dress, clutching a handkerchief wet with tears, when the lawyer cleared his throat and began to read the will. His voice was steady, professional, and merciless. To my beloved, I leave my gratitude for the years we shared, but all my assets, properties, and accounts shall go to... I waited, holding my breath, praying for my name, for my children's names, for some shred of loyalty to remain even in death, but instead, the name that echoed through the pews was not mine. It was hers. The Mistress. The woman whose perfume had once stained my husband's collar, the woman whose shadow I had spent years denying. The lawyer repeated her name again, with the weight of legality, with the authority of ink and paper. I felt every eye in the room turn toward me, as if I were a stranger in my own life. I cannot describe the burn of humiliation when whispers began to coil through the crowd. Some gasped audibly, others lowered their heads in pity, but no one, not one soul, dared to step forward. I clutched the pew for balance, my knuckles white, my chest so tight I thought I would suffocate. My husband had not only betrayed me in life, he had erased me in death. I could hear the mistress's heels clicking on the marble floor as she approached the altar with a smirk carved onto her painted lips. She did not weep, she did not tremble. She stood tall, glowing in triumph, while I crumbled inside. I wanted to scream, to tear that document from the lawyer's hands and shred it to pieces, but all I could do was stand frozen as she leaned over the coffin, placing a red rose on top as though she were the widow, as though she were the rightful heir of everything I had sacrificed for decades to build. My heart shattered in silence, but my mind ignited with fire. Do you know what it feels like to watch your whole life vanish in front of strangers? To realize the man you loved chose deceit over loyalty, and to have that betrayal read aloud in sacred space as if it were gospel? Do you know the sting of watching your children stare in confusion, too shocked to move, too ashamed to look at their own mother? I swallowed my pain, but inside I asked myself one question. How could he? How could a man who once swore eternal devotion, who once placed a wedding band on my finger with trembling hands, erase me with a single sentence in a will? But here is what no one in that church knew. My husband left behind more than a coffin, more than a piece of paper soaked in treachery. He left behind a secret he never intended anyone to find. And that secret was hidden in the most ordinary of objects, the pocket watch he always carried, the one he said had belonged to his father, the one he never let out of his sight. That pocket watch was more than a keepsake. It was a vault, and inside it my husband's own voice lived on, whispering from beyond the grave, exposing the truth that would turn this humiliation into my weapon. When the will was finished, and the mistress stood in false victory, I lowered my eyes, pretending defeat, letting them believe I was broken. But inside, I was already clutching the invisible thread of hope, the knowledge that not everything was lost. That watch was in my possession now, heavy in my purse, pressing against the fabric like a heartbeat. And I knew, with a certainty as sharp as a blade, that the game was not over. Not yet. I want you to imagine the silence of that moment. The priest murmured prayers. The organ played soft lamentations. But none of it reached me. All I could hear was the echo of the lawyer's words and the cruel giggle of the mistress as she dabbed fake tears with her lace handkerchief. She had won, or so she thought. She looked at me with a mixture of triumph and pity, as if I were a relic destined for the shadows of history. And perhaps everyone else believed that too. Perhaps they thought I was nothing but a discarded wife, a footnote in the life of a man who had chosen passion over loyalty. But they were wrong, because while she stood in her shallow glory, I remembered the long nights of sacrifice. The years I worked 2 jobs to help my husband launch his business, the countless times I put my own dreams aside so he could chase his. I remembered the meals I skipped so our children could eat, the holidays I spent alone while he traveled for work, the bruising loneliness of knowing something was wrong but lacking proof. And now proof was all I had, proof tucked inside that watch, proof waiting to burst into the light. But do you know the cruelest part? For a split second standing before his coffin, I still missed him. I still wanted to believe there was a mistake, that somehow his hand had been forced, that he hadn't truly wanted to destroy me. I wanted to believe the man I had once loved had not died with such betrayal on his lips. That fragile hope was what kept me standing when everything else in me collapsed. And yet, as I stared at the mistress's smug smile, I realized hope alone could not save me. If I remained silent, she would take everything: the house I built into a home, the savings I sacrificed to grow, the heirlooms of generations past. She would walk away with my husband's name, my husband's fortune, and the reputation of being the one woman he truly loved. And I, what would I be? A ghost? A discarded widow with nothing but memories that now tasted like poison. That thought jolted me awake. In that instant, humiliation turned into fury. I stopped being the victim of his betrayal and became the guardian of my own dignity. I knew I would not leave that church defeated. Perhaps not today, perhaps not in front of all those judging eyes, but soon, very soon, they would know the truth. So I tell you this, not as a broken woman, but as someone preparing for war. My husband left everything to his mistress, yes, but what she doesn't know is that he also left me the weapon to destroy her. And when I open that pocket watch, when I release the voice of a dead man, the lies they built will crumble like dust. The question is not whether I will fight. The question is how far I will go, and whether you, listening to my story, believe you would have the courage to do the same if you were in my place. Because when betrayal strikes at the heart, when love transforms into humiliation, you must decide. Will you drown in grief, or will you rise from the ashes and reclaim your name? I had made my choice, and this is where my story begins. The day after the funeral, the house was unbearably silent. The black ribbons still hung on the front door. The vases of wilting lilies filled the living room with the stale scent of grief. But what gnawed at me most was not death. It was betrayal. I walked through the rooms like a stranger, touching the furniture we had chosen together decades ago, running my fingers along the edges of picture frames where our family once smiled. Everything looked the same, but everything had changed. I tried to convince myself that maybe the will had been altered at the last minute, that perhaps there was another version somewhere hidden in the lawyer's files, but denial was a fragile comfort. That night, when the guests had left and even the mistress had driven away in her shining car, I sat at the dining table with a glass of untouched wine and stared at the documents the lawyer had given me. My name was nowhere. Not in the properties, not in the accounts, not even in the sentimental items that should have been mine by right of love and loyalty. The will was ruthless, almost cruelly precise, and it screamed one thing at me: you are nothing. But deep down, I knew something didn't fit. My husband had many faults. He was unfaithful, selfish at times, blinded by vanity, but he was not careless with appearances. For years, he had maintained the image of a respectable husband, a family man. Even in his betrayals, he always cloaked himself in secrecy. So why would he leave behind a will that would expose everything so nakedly, humiliating me in front of the entire family? It didn't sound like him. That suspicion became the first crack in the mask. I began replaying the weeks before his death in my mind, searching for any sign I had ignored. And then, like lightning, I remembered. 3 weeks before his collapse, he had returned home late one night. He claimed he had been at a board meeting, but when he hung his coat, I noticed something glinting from the pocket. A pen. Not just any pen, but a gold fountain pen engraved with the initials of the lawyer who had read the will. I remember asking casually, "Where did you get that?" He froze for half a second too long, then muttered, "Oh, he lent it to me after a signing." At the time, I dismissed it. But now, the memory pulsed with meaning. What document had he been signing so secretly with that lawyer weeks before his death? That night, I could not sleep. I tossed and turned in the wide bed that suddenly felt like an ocean of emptiness. My mind dragged me back to another image, a sealed envelope on his desk that he quickly tucked away when I entered the room. I never asked, because after years of marriage, you learn which silences to keep. But maybe that envelope had been more than a business contract. Maybe it had been the beginning of the betrayal that exploded at his funeral. The next morning, I searched his study with trembling hands. The mahogany desk was immaculate, the drawers organized, but I knew his habits too well. He always left traces, small crumbs of his private world. And there, tucked under a stack of outdated newspapers, I found it, a receipt. It was dated a month before his death, a dinner for two at a luxury restaurant. The name on the bill was not his, but hers, the Mistress. My heart clenched as I read the signature, her handwriting bold and looping beside his discreet scrawl. I sank into the leather chair, gripping the paper as though it might burn my skin. So it was true. They had been planning this together for longer than I dared imagine. The will, the betrayal. It wasn't a last-minute decision. It was a carefully orchestrated scheme. I should have cried, but no tears came. Instead, my rage crystallized into clarity. They had underestimated me. They thought I would bow my head, accept humiliation, and fade quietly into the background. They thought a widow's silence would be the perfect cover for their theft, but they forgot that silence can be sharper than any blade when the time comes to break it. That night, as the rain tapped against the windows, I took the pocket watch from my purse and held it in my palm. The metal was cool, the engraving worn smooth from years of his touch. I pressed the latch and listened to the soft click as it opened. Inside, the familiar face of the watch ticked with mechanical precision. But behind it, I knew there was more. My husband was a man of secrets. He had always tinkered with hidden compartments, as if life itself were a puzzle only he could solve. My fingers searched along the rim until I felt it, a small notch. I pressed, and the inner plate shifted. My breath caught. Beneath the brass cover lay a tiny recorder, its red light faint but alive. My pulse thundered in my ears. Was this the proof I had been waiting for? I hesitated. Part of me was terrified of what I might hear. What if the recording shattered even the last fragments of love I still clung to? What if it confirmed not only betrayal, but willing cruelty? But another part of me, the part that had been humiliated in front of hundreds, demanded the truth. I pressed play. At first, only static filled the room, the hiss of time captured on tape. Then his voice emerged, my husband's voice. Lower, weaker than I remembered, but unmistakably his. He was speaking to someone, no, arguing. The other voice was faint, but I recognized the sharp, mocking tone of the Mistress. "Sign it," she urged. "If you care about me, if you don't want me to leave, you'll make it official. You'll erase her." "I can't," he muttered. "It will destroy her. She gave me everything." "You owe me," she snapped. "Do you want me to tell everyone what you've done? Do you want the board to know about the money you moved?" My blood ran cold. I gripped the watch as though it might slip away. They had blackmailed him. The will had not been love. It had been extortion. My husband's weakness, his guilt, had been the trap. His voice trembled. "Fine, I'll sign. But you'll regret this one day." And then the recording ended. I sat there in the dark, The rain pounding harder outside, my heart pounding just as loud inside. The truth had cracked open. The will was poisoned. The mistress had forced his hand, and now I had the proof, but proof was not enough. I knew the road ahead would be treacherous. If I revealed the recording too soon, they would twist it, call it fabricated, accuse me of madness. I needed more. I needed to weave a net so tight that when the truth came out, not even the most silver-tongued lawyer could save them. And so, with the pocket watch pressed against my chest, I made my vow. I would uncover every lie, every secret, every betrayal that had led to this humiliation. I would turn their conspiracy into their downfall. And when the time came, I would not whisper the truth in private. I would roar it into the world where everyone could hear. The first round of their game was theirs, but from this moment on, the board belonged to me. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of whispers and sidelong glances. In the market, neighbors lowered their voices when I passed. At church, women pressed their lips tight, their eyes full of pity, as though I were a ghost walking among them. It was not grief they saw in me. It was shame. The widow whose husband left everything to another woman. That humiliation was worse than death. But humiliation has a way of sharpening your senses. Every look, every murmur, every trace of condescension only fueled the fire burning inside me. I kept my head low, but inside I was listening, calculating, preparing. It was on the third day after the funeral that a knock at my door changed everything. I opened it to find Mrs. Carter, our former housekeeper. She'd worked for us for nearly a decade before retiring last year. Her hands were gnarled with age, but her eyes were sharp as ever. She clutched a small handbag as if it contained something fragile, something dangerous. "May I come in?" she asked, her voice low. I led her to the kitchen, poured tea, and waited. She sat across from me, fidgeting with the clasp of her purse. For a long time, she said nothing. Finally, she leaned forward, her voice a whisper. "There are things you need to know, Mrs. Hughes. Things about your husband and about her." Her words struck me like a slap. My pulse quickened. "What things?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Mrs. Carter glanced around the room as though the walls themselves might betray us. During my last year working here, I noticed patterns. She came often, the young woman. At first, I thought she was a business associate. She dressed too finely for anything else. But then, I started to see the truth. Her eyes glistened with the burden of memory. One evening, your husband asked me to prepare a late supper. I brought the tray to his study, but the door was ajar. I saw her sitting at his desk, flipping through documents. She wasn't just a lover. She was involved in his affairs. I heard her whispering about accounts, about signatures. It wasn't affection I saw in her eyes. It was calculation. My hands tightened around the teacup, so I wasn't insane. My instincts had been right. "Why didn't you tell me then?" I asked. Mrs. Carter lowered her head. "Because I thought it wasn't my place. Because I needed the job. And because your husband begged me not to speak. He caught me watching and told me to forget what I had seen. He paid me extra that month. But I could never erase the image." She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded sheet of paper, its edges yellowed with time. "I kept this," she whispered. "It's a copy of a note she left behind one night by mistake. She must have slipped it under a stack of ledgers. I meant to give it back, but something told me to hold on to it." I unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. The handwriting was unmistakable. The same bold loops I had seen on the restaurant receipt. The note was short, but damning. "We must move quickly. The lawyer is ready. Once the will is signed, she will have nothing. Burn this after reading." My vision blurred with rage. The arrogance, the audacity, to write out the plot so plainly as if I were already dead and buried. I looked at Mrs. Carter, my throat tight. "Why bring this to me now?" She met my eyes with fierce sincerity. "Because when I heard the will read, I knew the trap was complete. But I also knew you would not bow down. I've seen your strength. You deserve to fight with every weapon available. I should have told you sooner. Forgive me." Tears welled in my eyes, but they were not tears of weakness. They were tears of vindication. For weeks I had doubted my sanity, questioned whether I was imagining conspiracies out of grief, but here it was, in black ink on paper, proof of collusion, proof that the mistress and the lawyer were partners in theft. I pressed the note to my chest and closed my eyes. The puzzle was assembling piece by piece: the gold pen, the hidden envelope, the receipt, the recording inside the pocket watch, and now this note, all pointed to the same truth. The will was nothing more than a weapon forged against me. But even with evidence, I knew caution was vital. If I revealed this too soon, they would dismiss Mrs. Carter as a bitter old woman, claim the note was a forgery, twist everything into a smear campaign. I needed more, something undeniable, something public. Still, this revelation gave me strength. I was no longer alone in my suspicions. Someone else had seen, had heard, had carried a fragment of the truth. That night, after Mrs. Carter left, I walked through the house with new eyes. Every corner seemed to whisper secrets. I found myself staring at the portrait of my husband above the fireplace. In it, he looked noble, confident, a man of stature. But now I wondered if the painter had captured not pride, but arrogance. I whispered to the canvas, "You thought you buried me. You thought she would erase me. But even in your lies, you left cracks, and I will break through." As the clock ticked past midnight, I returned to the pocket watch and replayed the recording. His voice, filled with weakness and fear, tangled with hers, sharp and venomous. I listened not with pain, but with purpose. Combined with Mrs. Carter's testimony, the recording transformed from a private wound into a weapon. I began to imagine the future, a courtroom packed with spectators, a lawyer's face paling as the tape played, the mistress's composure crumbling as the note surfaced. For the first time since the funeral, I allowed myself to smile, but even as hope flickered, I knew the war was far from won. They still held power, wealth, and public sympathy. To the world, she was the grieving companion, the chosen one. To the world, I was the discarded wife. My path ahead would be steep, filled with traps. But now I had allies. The dead voice of my husband, the courage of Mrs. Carter, and above all, the unyielding fire of a woman stripped of everything but her dignity. Round 1 had given me suspicion. Round 2 had given me proof. And I knew that round 3 would test me in ways I had never imagined, because once they realized I was no longer silent, they would come for me with everything they had. It was 1 week after the funeral when the whispers stopped being whispers and became daggers aimed at my back. At first, it was just the neighbors exchanging looks, the church women clutching their rosaries a little tighter when I passed, but soon it spread like fire. The mistress had begun weaving her own version of the story, and she was ruthless in her craft. In her tale, I was not the betrayed wife, but the bitter widow, jealous and unhinged, incapable of accepting that my husband had chosen her over me. I heard it first from my cousin, who came to visit with a basket of fruit and eyes full of discomfort. She sat at the edge of my couch, as though the cushions might burn her, and said softly, "They're saying you're not well. That grief has turned you into someone unstable." My hands froze on the teacup I had been lifting. "Who is saying this?" I demanded. She looked away, her cheeks flushing. "The mistress, her family, even some of your in-laws. They say your husband left you nothing because you were reckless with money, that he couldn't trust you anymore." The lie cut deeper than the truth ever had. For decades, I had managed our household, saved pennies where I could, sacrificed my own needs for the family. And now, they painted me as wasteful, irresponsible, unworthy. My cousin left soon after, but her words lingered like poison in the air. The humiliation grew heavier by the day. At the grocery store, I caught 2 women pointing at me, whispering, "That's her. the one whose husband abandoned her. Poor thing, must have lost her mind. At church, the priest avoided my eyes during the sermon, his words about forgiveness twisting like a knife in my chest. And at home, the phone calls began. Anonymous voices, mocking laughter, cruel words. Maybe if you had been a better wife, he wouldn't have left you with nothing. But the worst blow came from my own children. My daughter, Emily, came to visit one afternoon. She was pale, nervous, her hands clutching her purse like a lifeline. She refused tea, refused to sit. Instead, she looked at me with eyes clouded by doubt. "Mother," she began, her voice trembling, "I need to ask you something. Did Father really leave everything to her because you were sick? Because you couldn't manage things anymore?" The question shattered me. "Emily," I whispered, "do you believe that?" She hesitated. That hesitation was a knife twisting in my chest. "I don't know what to believe," she admitted. "She's been saying that Father was protecting us, that you weren't capable anymore, that you've been irrational." I stood, my body trembling with fury and heartbreak. Irrational? I sacrificed everything for this family. I carried you, fed you, clothed you, built this home, brick by brick, with my own hands while your father was out chasing his ambitions. And now you stand in front of me and ask if I am sick, if I am unfit. Tears filled her eyes, but she said nothing. She only whispered, "I just don't want to lose you, Mother." And then she left. The door closed behind her, and I sank to the floor, sobs racking my body. That was the moment I realized the true cruelty of their scheme. It wasn't enough to steal my inheritance, my dignity. They wanted to steal my children's love, to isolate me so thoroughly that when the time came to strike back, no one would stand by my side. The isolation was suffocating. The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, now echoed with silence. I found myself speaking to the portraits on the walls, to the ghost of my husband, demanding answers he could no longer give. Nights were the worst. Alone in the bed that once held two, I lay awake. The shadows whispering all the cruel words I had heard during the day. But even as despair threatened to drown me, I clung to the pocket watch, to the folded note Mrs. Carter had given me. They were my lifeline, my proof that I was not mad, not broken, not worthless. Each time doubt gnawed at me, I pressed play on the recording, listening to his trembling voice, the mistress's sharp commands, the unmistakable coercion. And each time I whispered into the darkness, "I am not crazy. I am not weak. I will not be erased." Yet the pressure did not stop. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky blood red, I heard the roar of an engine outside. When I opened the door, I saw her, the mistress. She stood on the front lawn in a crimson dress, her hair perfect, her lips curled into a victorious smile. Beside her was a man I recognized, the lawyer. Together they looked like predators circling wounded prey. She called out loud enough for the neighbors to hear, "This house will be mine soon. You're only delaying the inevitable." Her laughter rang out, cruel and triumphant, and I saw curtains twitch in the nearby houses as neighbors peeked out to watch the spectacle. The lawyer handed me a paper, his voice cold. "You'll need to vacate once the transfer is complete. I suggest you make arrangements sooner rather than later." I felt the eyes of the entire street on me, watching, judging. My humiliation was now a public spectacle. My hands shook as I took the paper, but I forced myself to stand tall. "You may have fooled them," I said, my voice low but steady. "But you will not destroy me. One day everyone will see you for what you truly are." They laughed. Together they laughed, and then drove away, leaving me on the porch with the paper clutched in my trembling hands. I could feel the neighbors' stares burning into my skin, their whispers already spreading like wildfire. That night I sat in the dark, the paper before me, the recording in my watch, the note from Mrs. Carter tucked safely away. They wanted me isolated, broken, discarded, and for a moment, I almost believed they had won. But then I remembered my husband's words on the recording, "You'll regret this one day." And I knew that day was coming. Round 3 had shown me the depths of their cruelty. They had stolen not only my inheritance, but my reputation, my family's trust, my standing in the community. They had painted me as unfit, unstable, unwanted, but they had also underestimated me. Because isolation does not weaken a woman like me, it sharpens her resolve. And in that sharpened silence, I began to plan the storm that would sweep them all away. There comes a moment in every battle when the body trembles, the spirit flickers, and defeat feels inevitable. Mine came 2 weeks after the funeral, on a night so black the moon refused to rise. I had not eaten in days, not truly. My appetite had withered under the weight of humiliation and betrayal. The phone calls had not stopped. Letters arrived in the mail, unsigned, mocking my widowhood. "Crazy woman," one note said in scrawled ink. "Everyone knows he never trusted you." I tore it up, but the words clung to my skin like soot. The isolation grew unbearable. My daughter, Emily, had not returned since our last confrontation. My son, Robert, refused to take my calls. I heard from a neighbor that he had been seen having lunch with her, the mistress, as though she had become his new mother. That betrayal, sharper than any knife, cut me to the bone. My own flesh and blood, sitting with the woman who had stolen everything. I paced the empty hallways of my home, clutching the pocket watch until my palm ached, whispering to myself just to fill the silence. The breaking point came when I opened the mailbox one morning and found an envelope with legal seals. Inside was a formal notice. I was being challenged in court, not only for the house, but for guardianship of my own life. They claimed I was mentally unfit to handle my affairs. They wanted to strip me of my autonomy, to lock me away in some sterile home, leaving her free to live in my house, wear my jewelry, sit at my table as though she had built it. My vision blurred. The paper shook in my hands until I collapsed on the porch steps, the world spinning around me. Neighbors watched from their windows but did not come to help. They whispered instead. "Poor thing," I heard one say. "She really has lost her mind." Their pity was worse than their cruelty. It confirmed the narrative the mistress had carefully planted. That was the day I nearly believed them. That was the day I almost surrendered. I remember stumbling back inside, my chest heavy, my breath shallow. I sat in the living room, surrounded by photographs of a family that no longer existed, and for the first time, I wondered if maybe I was insane. Maybe my grief had warped my memory. Maybe my husband had loved her more than me all along. Maybe the watch, the note, the suspicions, maybe I had invented them to shield myself from the truth. The thought terrified me. I replayed the recording again and again, desperate to confirm I hadn't imagined it. His voice trembled through the static. "Fine, I'll sign. But you'll regret this one day." I clung to those words as a drowning woman clings to driftwood, but even they began to feel fragile, uncertain. My heart begged me to trust, but my mind whispered doubts planted by their relentless lies. That night, exhaustion conquered me. I collapsed into bed, fully clothed, the watch clutched against my chest. In my dreams, I was back in the church, standing before his coffin. The mistress laughed from the front pew. The lawyer signed papers in the shadows. My children turned their backs. And when I cried out, begging someone to hear me, no sound came. My voice was gone. I woke gasping, drenched in sweat. My throat raw from screams no one had heard. I was unraveling. I knew it. My reflection in the mirror was pale, gaunt, my eyes rimmed red from sleepless nights. The woman who stared back at me was not the strong wife I once had been, not the dignified mother who raised 2 children. She was a ghost, fragile, almost transparent. The thought that they might succeed, that they might truly erase me, became a weight pressing on my chest until I could hardly breathe. And then came the visit. One stormy evening, a knock rattled the front door. I opened it to find 2 men in suits, their umbrellas dripping rain onto the porch. They introduced themselves as court officers. "We're here to serve notice," one said coldly. They handed me documents declaring the petition to evaluate my mental state. At the bottom was the mistress's signature, bold and triumphant. "Ma'am, you'll need to appear before the judge in 3 weeks," the officer continued, his eyes avoiding mine. "Failure to comply may result in temporary guardianship being assigned." His words were polite, but I could feel the contempt behind them, the belief that I was just another senile widow clinging to a fantasy. When they left, the rain poured harder, soaking the documents in my hands until the ink bled like tears. I stumbled back inside and collapsed onto the floor. The house shook with thunder, lightning illuminating the portraits on the wall like silent judges. For the first time, I wept without restraint. I wept for the years I had wasted, for the love that had betrayed me, for the children who no longer trusted me. I wept until my body convulsed, until my voice broke, until I was certain I could not rise again. That was the lowest moment of my life. I lay there in the darkness, the documents strewn around me like funeral shrouds, and I whispered, maybe they're right. Maybe I am finished. But then, through the thunder, through the sobs, I felt it, the weight of the pocket watch pressing against my ribs. I reached for it with trembling fingers, opened it, and let the recording play once more. My husband's voice filled the room, weak, frightened, but real. "You'll regret this one day." The words cut through the despair like a blade. They reminded me that I was not imagining things, that I was not insane, that I was fighting not against shadows but against flesh and blood enemies who had crafted a web of lies. I sat up slowly, wiping my tears with the back of my sleeve. The storm still raged outside. But inside me, something shifted. Yes, I was broken. Yes, I was isolated, humiliated, painted as unstable. But I was not finished. I was still alive. And as long as I had breath in my lungs and proof in my hands, I would not surrender. Round 4 was meant to crush me. It almost did. But in the ashes of that collapse, something harder, sharper, more dangerous began to form. A resolve forged in humiliation and fire. They had dragged me to the edge of despair, but they had failed to push me over, and for that mistake, they would pay. The morning after the storm, I woke with swollen eyes and a raw throat, but also with a strange, simmering clarity. Something inside me had shifted during the night. Perhaps it was the words from the recording still echoing in my mind. Perhaps it was the humiliation finally reaching its limit. But I knew I could not spend another day curled on the floor as if waiting for my execution. I had been dragged through the mud long enough. If they wanted a war for my dignity, then I would give them one. I began with the smallest act. I washed my face. I combed my hair, pulled it back neatly, and dressed in a dark blue dress that had been hanging in the closet for years, waiting for an occasion I had never dared to attend. It fit snug but firm, like armor. I stood in front of the mirror and studied my reflection. My eyes were tired, yes, my cheeks pale, but behind them I saw something I had almost forgotten. I saw fire. That same morning the doorbell rang. My first instinct was dread. I expected more court officers, more documents, more daggers dressed as formalities. But when I opened the door, I found Joseph, my husband's oldest business partner. His coat was wet from the lingering drizzle, his hands trembling slightly as he held a leather folder. He looked at me with eyes full of sorrow and something more, urgency. "May I come in?" he asked softly. I hesitated, then nodded. We sat at the dining table where so many meals had once been shared in happier times. He placed the folder on the table, exhaled deeply, and said, I cannot stay silent anymore. I stared at him, my pulse racing. What do you mean? He rubbed his temples, as if carrying a weight too heavy for one man. Your husband, Robert. He was not himself in the last months. I watched him unravel. He confided in me more than once, but I was a coward. I didn't want to get involved in your private matters, but after that will was read, after seeing the humiliation you endured, I realized I must tell you everything I know. He slid the folder toward me. My fingers shook as I opened it. Inside were copies of emails, bank transfers, and contracts. As I read, my breath caught. The mistress's name appeared again and again. Large sums of money had been transferred into her accounts, not from my husband directly, but funneled through shell companies the lawyer had created. The documents told a story not of love, but of extortion. Joseph's voice was low, steady. He came to me weeks before his death, panicked. He said she was threatening him, that if he didn't sign the will, she would expose a mistake he had made years ago, a financial irregularity that could have destroyed his company. He was desperate. He said he wanted to protect his family's name, even if it meant sacrificing you. I told him it was madness, but he was trapped. He signed under duress. He told me if anything happened to him, I should come to you with this. I pressed the papers to my chest, my eyes stinging with tears. Proof. Not suspicion, not whispers, not my own fragile memory. Proof. My husband had been weak, but he had left me a weapon, however belatedly, through Joseph's courage. I looked at him, my voice trembling but firm. Why didn't you give me this earlier? He lowered his gaze. Because I was afraid. That woman, that lawyer, they are ruthless. They have friends in high places. I thought staying silent would protect me. But silence is poison, and I will not drink it anymore. For the first time in weeks, I felt something more than despair. I felt strength returning to my veins, like blood rushing back to a frozen limb. I was not alone. I had allies now. Mrs. Carter's testimony, Joseph's documents, the recording in the pocket watch. Together they formed a shield and soon a sword. That afternoon I sat at my husband's desk, surrounded by evidence. I spread the papers out in front of me like a general preparing for battle. Every receipt, every transfer, every note became a piece of my arsenal. I replayed the recording until I could recite it by heart, the words etched into my memory like scripture. And slowly, a plan began to form. The first step was to secure my proof. I contacted a lawyer I trusted, a man named Carlos who had handled minor matters for me years ago. He was honest, discreet, and most importantly, not connected to my husband's former circle. When I met him in his modest office downtown, I laid everything before him. The watch, the note, Joseph's documents. He listened without interrupting, his brow furrowed deeper with every revelation. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes sharp. Mrs. Hughes, what you have here is not just evidence of coercion. This is fraud, conspiracy, and possibly embezzlement. If presented correctly, it could not only overturn the will, but also bring charges against both the mistress and the lawyer. My breath caught. You really believe I can win? His gaze softened. I don't just believe it. I know it. But it won't be easy. They will fight viciously. They will paint you as unstable, as they already have. They will try to destroy your credibility before the judge. We need to be meticulous. Every detail matters. I nodded, determination hardening within me. Then we will be meticulous. I am done being silent. Carlos smiled faintly. Good. Because silence is exactly what they expect from you. Breaking it is your greatest weapon. That night, back in my home, I lit a single candle and placed it by my husband's portrait. I stared into his painted eyes, the eyes that had once charmed me, the eyes that had betrayed me, the eyes that now stared down with eternal stillness. You were weak, I whispered. You let her corner you, but I will not let your weakness erase me. You may have left me nothing in that will, but you left me the truth, and I will use it. For the first time in weeks, I slept without nightmares. My body, though bruised by despair, felt lighter. The path ahead was still dark, full of traps and enemies, but I was walking it no longer as a victim. I was stepping onto it as a warrior. The turning point was not just in the evidence I had gathered, it was in the transformation inside me. I no longer asked myself whether I deserved dignity. I knew I did. I no longer wondered whether I could endure the humiliation. I knew I could rise above it. And as I drifted into sleep, one thought anchored me like steel. The storm was coming, and this time, it would not consume me. It would consume them. The meeting was not planned by accident. I chose the place carefully, a setting that would strip away her comfort and expose her without an audience to applaud her false victory. It was the old conservatory near the edge of town, a glass house long abandoned, where vines crawled through shattered windows and rain leaked through the roof. It was once a place where families came to admire orchids and roses, but now it was a ruin, silent, cold, and perfect. I sent her a single message: come alone. If you want to know the truth about him, meet me where things rot. She came. Of course she came. The mistress could never resist the scent of drama, especially if she thought it would end with my humiliation. I heard the sharp click of her heels before I saw her. She stepped into the conservatory wearing a crimson coat, her lips painted to match, her chin lifted high as if she were entering a stage rather than a ruin. The damp air curled around us, carrying the smell of earth and decay. "So?" she said, her voice slicing through the silence. The forgotten widow finally dares to confront me. I remained still, my hands folded in front of me, the pocket watch heavy in my coat. My voice was calm, though my chest thundered. "I didn't call you here to fight. I called you here to listen." Her laugh was sharp, hollow. "Listen to what? Your sobs? Your pathetic begging for scraps? I already have everything, darling. The will is mine. The house will be mine. Even your children know where the power lies now. You have nothing left to give." I took one step closer. The broken glass crunched beneath my shoe. "You're wrong. I still have the truth." For the first time, a flicker of unease crossed her face. She masked it quickly with another laugh, but I saw the twitch at the corner of her lips. "Truth? Oh, please, you're delusional. Everyone knows you've been unraveling. They whisper it in the church pews, in the markets. You're a woman drowning in her own madness. That's why he left you nothing. He saw what I see, a burden." Her words were venom, but I had already built my armor. I let them slide off me like rain on glass. "And yet," I said softly, pulling the watch from my pocket, "he left this." Her eyes fixed on it, narrowing. She tilted her head, feigning boredom, but her voice betrayed a tremor. "A trinket. Is this what you called me here for? To wave a broken toy at me?" I pressed the latch and let the soft click echo through the ruin. The watch opened, the recorder glinting in the dim light. "This toy holds his voice, his real voice, not the one bent under your lies, but the voice of a man pushed to the edge by your threats." She scoffed, but I saw her hands tighten around the belt of her coat. "Fabrications. You could have recorded anything. People will laugh at you." I stepped closer until I could see my reflection in her eyes. "Then why are you afraid?" The silence that followed was louder than any scream. Her lips parted, then closed again. For once she had no ready insult, no rehearsed line of mockery. The ruins around us groaned as the wind rattled the glass panes, but all I heard was her shallow breathing. I let the tension stretch until it felt like the air might crack. Then I whispered, "You blackmailed him. You forced him to sign." "I know. He confessed it in this watch, and I have witnesses to your schemes. Mrs. Carter saw you rifling through his papers. Joseph has the transfers you orchestrated. You think you've painted me as unstable, but when the world hears his voice and sees the documents, the story will collapse. And so will you." Her eyes widened, fury flashing across her face. She lunged closer, her perfume sharp and sickly in the damp air. "If you dare release anything, I will destroy you. Do you hear me? I will bury you deeper than you already are. No one will believe you." I smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that I had not felt in years. "That's where you're wrong. They already believe me. They just don't know it yet. Because truth is patient, and lies rot." For a moment, her mask slipped. I saw the fear beneath the arrogance, the panic she could no longer completely hide. Her eyes darted to the watch, then back to me, as though calculating whether she could snatch it, smash it, erase the evidence before it spread. But she hesitated, and in that hesitation, I knew I had her. I leaned close enough that my breath touched her ear. "You thought I was weak. You mistook silence for surrender, but silence can be a weapon, and when it breaks, it shatters everything in its path. Prepare yourself, because the world is about to hear what you've done." Her hand trembled as she lifted it, as if to strike me, but she let it fall, her nails digging into her palms instead. She turned sharply, her heels cracking against the stone floor, and stormed out of the conservatory. Her red coat flared behind her like a banner of retreat. I stood alone in the ruin, the watch warm in my hand, my breath steady. For the first time since the funeral, I felt the balance shift. The mistress had looked me in the eye and seen not a broken widow, but a storm-gathering strength. I knew she would fight harder now, more viciously than ever, but she also knew the truth. Her fortress of lies had cracks, and I was ready to widen them until the whole structure fell. As I left the conservatory, the rain had stopped. The air smelled of wet earth and new beginnings. My steps were slow, deliberate, but each one carried the weight of a decision already made. The private war was over. The public war was about to begin. The public confrontation arrived sooner than I expected. It was not in a courtroom with robes and gavels, but in the very heart of the family. My husband's memorial reception, the gathering where his legacy was to be honored one last time. The mistress herself had arranged it, inviting distant relatives, business partners, and half the town. She wanted a stage, and she wanted to play the grieving widow in front of an audience large enough to cement her place in history. I knew this was the moment. Carlos, my lawyer, had urged caution, had warned me that timing was everything. But when I stepped into that grand hall, the chandeliers blazing, the tables covered with white cloths and crystal glasses, I felt destiny press against my chest. My humiliation had begun in public, and it would end in public. The room fell into a hush when I arrived. I felt the eyes, the whispers. Some were sympathetic, but most were cruel, hungry for drama. And then she appeared, gliding across the polished floor in a black gown that clung to her like armor. The mistress, radiant in her counterfeit grief, raised a glass of champagne and tapped it with a silver fork. The chime echoed like a bell of war. "Friends, family, partners," she began, her voice rich with false sorrow. "We are here not only to mourn, but to celebrate the man who loved deeply, who chose courageously, and who left behind a legacy I am honored to continue." Her eyes flicked toward me with venom. Robert entrusted his life's work, his fortune, his future to me, and I promise I will honor that trust with all my heart. Applause rippled through the room, hesitant but real. My own children sat at a table nearby, their faces pale, uncertain, caught between doubt and shame. I felt their silence like knives. I rose slowly, my chair scraping the floor. The sound cut through the applause, sharp and jarring. I walked to the center of the room, my heels clicking steadily, my heart pounding like a drum. All eyes followed me. The mistress froze, her smile stiffening. "Honored?" I said, my voice clear, carrying over the murmurs. "You speak of honor, but what you carry is not his honor. It is his shame." A gasp rippled through the crowd. The mistress's eyes blazed. "How dare you interrupt? This is not your moment. You lost that when he left you nothing." I turned, addressing the crowd, my hands steady. "You all saw the will. You all heard his fortune was given to her, and you believed the story that I was unfit, unstable, unworthy. But what if I told you the will was poisoned? That he signed not out of love, but out of fear?" The whispers swelled, rising like a tide. The mistress's face tightened. "Lies," she hissed. "She is desperate, clinging to fantasies." I pulled the pocket watch from my purse. The room seemed to hold its breath. This belonged to him. He carried it every day. Inside, he left more than time. He left his voice. The mistress lunged forward, her hand outstretched, but I snapped the watch open with a click that echoed like thunder. I pressed play. At first, only static. Then his voice filled the hall, trembling, desperate. "I can't. It will destroy her. She gave me everything." The crowd froze. The mistress paled. Then her voice followed, sharp and cold. "Sign it. If you care about me, you'll make it official. You'll erase her." The recording continued, my husband's reluctant words. "Fine, I'll sign, but you'll regret this one day." Gasps erupted. Chairs scraped. Hands covered mouths. The room had transformed into a courtroom, the chandelier into a judge's gavel. My husband had spoken from beyond the grave, and his words condemned her more thoroughly than I ever could. The mistress shook her head violently. "No, it's fabricated. She doctored it. But Joseph stepped forward from the crowd, his old face stern, his hands holding the folder of documents. I was his partner. I saw the fear in his eyes. He told me she threatened him. Here are the transfers, the accounts she drained under the lawyer's guidance. He laid the papers on the table, the evidence for all to see. Then Mrs. Carter rose, her cane tapping against the marble floor. Her voice, though frail, carried power. I saw her in his study. I saw her rifling through papers. She was no companion. She was a thief. The hall erupted into chaos. People shouted, some in outrage, others in disbelief. My children stood, their faces stricken, their illusions shattering. My daughter whispered, "Mother," her voice breaking. I turned back to the mistress, who now stood trembling, her mask crumbling before the crowd. "You thought you could erase me," I said softly, my voice cutting through the noise. "But you cannot erase the truth. You cannot erase the sacrifices I made, the life I built, the dignity I refused to surrender. You mistook silence for weakness. But tonight silence breaks." The mistress staggered, clutching the edge of the table. "No, this isn't... It can't..." Carlos stepped forward, his briefcase in hand. His voice was calm, professional. "These recordings and documents have already been filed with the court. Legal proceedings will follow. Tonight, the only thing left is to face the truth." The crowd parted, and I saw the shift in their eyes. The pity was gone. The contempt was gone. In its place was respect, even awe. The whispers changed tone. She was right all along. She fought back. She didn't break. My children approached, tears streaming down their faces. My daughter collapsed into my arms, whispering apologies. My son could not meet my eyes, shame written across his features, but I held them both. This was not the moment to punish. This was the moment to reclaim. The mistress screamed then, a shrill sound that cut through the hall. She grabbed the glass of champagne and hurled it against the wall, the shards exploding like her composure. "You'll pay for this!" she shrieked. "You'll all pay!" But no one listened. She was no longer the grieving widow, no longer the chosen heir. She was exposed, naked in her greed, and the crowd turned from her as if she were already forgotten. I closed the watch and slipped it back into my purse. The hall was silent now, every eye fixed on me. For the first time since the nightmare began, I felt the weight lift from my chest. I stood taller, my voice steady. He left me nothing in the will, but tonight he left me everything that matters: the truth, my dignity, and the knowledge that betrayal cannot bury me. The chandeliers glittered overhead like stars. The air was electric, heavy with revelation, and as I walked out of that hall, my children at my side, I knew the tide had turned. The humiliation that had once chained me had become my weapon, and the storm I had promised was now unleashed. The night of the memorial changed everything, but its echoes reached far beyond the hall. Once the watch had spoken, once Joseph laid down the transfers and Mrs. Carter told her truth, the story ceased to be mine alone. It belonged now to the witnesses, to the crowd, to the city that could not stop talking about what they had seen. The very next morning, I woke to the sound of voices outside my house. I pulled back the curtain and saw neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, their faces animated with shock, curiosity, even admiration. Where once they had turned away from me, muttering that I had lost my mind, now they stood in clusters, whispering words that drifted through my window. She was right all along. She fought back. Did you hear the recording? One neighbor, Mrs. Lopez, caught sight of me and raised her hand awkwardly, as though unsure if she had the right. I opened the door and she hurried across the yard. I owe you an apology, she stammered. I believed her lies. We all did. But last night we saw who you really are. You're stronger than any of us imagined. Her eyes filled with tears. People are already calling you an example. They say you stood against the devil herself and didn't flinch. Her words startled me. But I realized then that the fire had begun to spread. What had been whispers of shame had become whispers of defiance, of respect, and whispers, once unleashed, move faster than truth itself. Later that afternoon, Carlos arrived at my house with a stack of newspapers. The story had already broken. Headlines screamed from the front pages: "Widow exposes Mistress's scheme at memorial. Recording reveals blackmail in Hughes' estate." Some carried grainy photos taken by guests who had recorded the confrontation on their phones. In one, I stood holding the pocket watch, my face illuminated by the chandelier, the mistress frozen behind me, her mask crumbling. Carlos placed the papers on the table and leaned close. "This is bigger than us now," he said quietly. "It's out of their control. The witnesses are telling their versions. The videos are spreading online. The more they try to silence you, the louder this will become. The fire is burning." And burn it did. Within days, journalists camped outside my home, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. "Mrs. Hughes, can you confirm the recording is authentic? Do you believe the mistress will face charges? How do you feel about the community now rallying behind you?" Their questions came like bullets, but for once, I did not shrink from them. I answered with dignity, each word calm and deliberate. "I am not seeking vengeance. I am seeking justice. And justice is not mine alone. It belongs to every woman, every widow, every parent who has been told they are weak simply because they chose silence." The response was electric. News stations replayed the clip of my words, anchormen praising my composure, commentators debating the legal implications. Strangers began leaving flowers at my gate, notes tucked into the petals. "Thank you for standing up. You gave me courage to fight for myself." Some left phone numbers, stories scribbled in shaky handwriting about their own betrayals, their own humiliations hidden behind closed doors. Even those who had once shunned me began to shift. The priest, who had avoided my eyes at church, knocked at my door, his voice trembling as he said, "Forgive me. I should have believed you. I see now that you carried a cross heavier than any sermon could describe." He offered to speak publicly on my behalf, to affirm my dignity before the congregation. I accepted, not because I needed his validation, but because every voice mattered in the war of truth against lies. But perhaps the most powerful witness of all was one I never expected, my daughter, Emily. She returned 3 days after the memorial, her eyes swollen from crying. She fell into my arms and sobbed, "Mother, I was blind. I doubted you. I let her poison my mind. Can you ever forgive me?" I held her close, my heart aching but resolute. "Yes," I whispered, "because you see the truth now. That is all I ever wanted." Her return was not just personal, it was public. She stood beside me in interviews, her voice breaking as she said, "I believed the lies, but I saw with my own eyes that my mother is not weak. She is the strongest woman I know." Her testimony cut deeper than any document. It showed the world that even poisoned bloodlines could be healed with truth. Meanwhile, the mistress's empire crumbled. Guests who had once praised her now shunned her. Business partners withdrew. Lawyers distanced themselves. On the streets, whispers followed her not of admiration but of scorn. That's her, the one who tried to erase the wife. She began hiding behind tinted car windows, her once triumphant smile replaced by shadows. The witnesses who once stood silent now pointed fingers openly. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky crimson, I stood at my balcony and watched the crowd gathered below. They were not jeering, they were cheering. They called my name, not as gossip, but as a banner. "Aurora! Aurora!" they chanted. I felt tears spill down my cheeks, not of sorrow, but of rebirth. That night, Carlos said to me, "Do you see now? This is no longer just your fight. The witnesses have carried it beyond you. The fire cannot be contained. It will burn until there is nothing left of their lies." I nodded slowly, clutching the pocket watch. "Then let it burn. Let the world see what happens when betrayal tries to bury dignity. Let them know silence can roar." For the first time since the will was read, I no longer felt alone. I was surrounded by an invisible army of witnesses, each carrying a fragment of my truth, each passing it along until the lie that once suffocated me had nowhere left to hide. What began as my private humiliation had become a public reckoning, and I knew, as surely as I knew my own name, that the mistress and her allies would never recover. The storm I had unleashed did not end with whispers, headlines, or applause. It rolled forward with the weight of justice, crushing everything in its path. The mistress, once radiant in her counterfeit triumph, now lived in the shadows. The lawyer who had enabled her schemes found himself stripped of his license, his reputation shredded, his name spat out like poison in every courtroom where he once strutted. And my family, yes, even my children, stood face to face with the wreckage of what greed had nearly destroyed. The first blow fell in the form of a summons. The district attorney had seen enough. Joseph's documents, the recording in the watch, Mrs. Carter's testimony, and the viral videos of the memorial hall. They opened a case of fraud, coercion, and embezzlement. The mistress and the lawyer were called to court, not as heirs, but as defendants. The same people who once whispered that I was insane now filled the gallery to watch their fall. The irony was almost too sharp to savor. I remember the day the trial began. I walked into the courthouse with Carlos at my side, the pocket watch secured like a sacred relic in my purse. My daughter Emily held my hand, her presence a balm against the ache of betrayal. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed. But I walked straight ahead, my head high. For the first time, I felt no shame, no fear, only clarity. The mistress sat at the defense table, pale and trembling, her once impeccable gowns replaced by plain suits that could not mask her desperation. She avoided my gaze, but I felt her every glance like a needle pricking her own conscience. The lawyer beside her, once smug, now looked gaunt, his career already ashes. They had bet everything on my silence, and silence had betrayed them. The trial lasted weeks. Witness after witness came forward. Joseph explained the transfers, showing how money flowed into her accounts like blood siphoned from a dying body. Mrs. Carter recounted the night she saw the mistress rifling through documents, her voice shaking but unyielding. And then came the recording. When the judge allowed it to be played, the courtroom froze. My husband's voice filled the chamber. "I can't. It will destroy her. She gave me everything." Then her sharp reply, "Sign it. If you care about me, you'll make it official. You'll erase her." The mistress tried to object, her lawyers claiming fabrication, but the judge silenced them. Experts verified the recording's authenticity. The evidence was undeniable. Each time the tape played, her mask slipped further until the only thing left was the naked truth. The verdict was swift: guilty of fraud, guilty of coercion, guilty of attempting to subvert the law through deceit. The mistress was sentenced to prison, her beauty and charm useless in the face of cold iron bars. The lawyer, stripped of every credential, faced fines and disgrace. The empire they had tried to build on my humiliation collapsed into dust. But justice was not only about them, it was also about me. The judge declared the contested will invalid, restoring the estate to its rightful course. My husband's fortune, once stolen, returned to my hands, not as a gift, but as restitution. Yet as I stood in the courtroom, hearing the gavel fall, I realized something startling. I did not feel triumph in the money, the properties, or the assets. What filled me with fierce joy was the silence that followed, the silence of a crowd that finally saw me not as a victim, not as a mad woman, but as a woman who had stood and fought until the truth shattered every lie. The social consequences spread faster than the legal ones. The mistress's name became a cautionary tale whispered in cafes and offices. Mothers told their daughters, "Do not be like her." Business partners erased her from their records. Friends who once clung to her wealth now fled from her disgrace. She became not a widow, not an heir, but a pariah. The lawyer fared no better. Clients abandoned him, his firm dissolved, his name printed in the papers alongside words like disgrace and corruption. He had gambled his career on one fraudulent will, and the world had seen his hand. He spent his days now not in luxury, but in obscurity, muttering excuses no one wanted to hear. And my children, the hardest wound to heal was theirs. My daughter Emily returned to me fully, her guilt heavy but her love sincere. She became my fiercest defender, speaking openly about how she had been deceived, how she had doubted me, and how she would never again let lies come between us. Each word from her lips healed a scar on my heart. My son Robert, however, was slower. He could not look me in the eye for months. The shame of his betrayal weighed on him, heavier than any punishment I could deliver. When he finally came to me, he fell to his knees, weeping. "Mother, I failed you. I let her poison me. I believed the lies. Can you ever forgive me?" I looked at him, this grown man who was once the boy I held in my arms, and I felt both pain and pity. Forgiveness is not easy when wounds are fresh, but I gave him what I could. "I forgive you," I said softly, "but forgiveness does not erase consequences. You must rebuild my trust, brick by brick, and you must live with the knowledge of how easily you let greed blind you." He nodded, broken, and I knew the lesson would haunt him for life. The house that had once felt like a tomb became mine again, not because the deed bore my name, but because I filled it with laughter once more. Friends returned, neighbors brought food, and the silence that once suffocated me became a peace I had earned. The flowers bloomed in the garden again, and when I walked the halls, I felt not the echo of betrayal, but the strength of survival. As for me, I became something I never expected, a symbol. Newspapers called me the widow who fought back, the woman who refused to be erased. Letters poured in from strangers, widows, mothers, daughters, telling me their own stories of humiliation, of inheritance stolen, of voices silenced. They thanked me for standing, for showing that silence can shatter chains. Some even called me brave. I did not feel brave. I felt necessary. The aftermath of betrayal is never clean. There are scars that no verdict can heal. There are nights when I still wake, hearing his voice in the watch, hearing the crack in his tone as he said, "You'll regret this one day." I wonder if regret was his prison long before hers became literal. But I also know this. I am no longer the woman who crouched in a church pew, humiliated, erased by ink on a page. I am the woman who rose, who fought, who reclaimed her dignity from the ashes. And as I sit by the window at dusk, watching the sun bleed into the horizon, I whisper to myself, justice was not just about punishing them. It was about proving that dignity can be stolen only if you let it, and I never will again. 2 years have passed since the night when the chandeliers flickered and my husband's voice rose from the dead to condemn the lies that tried to bury me. 2 years since I stood in that hall and let the truth roar after months of silence. The world has moved on, as it always does, but I remain here, living in the same house that once felt like a prison, except now it feels different. Now it feels mine. Not because of the deeds or the verdict, but because I reclaimed it with my own hands, my own voice, my own refusal to surrender. I have filled these rooms with new memories. My daughter comes often, bringing her children, their laughter echoing against the walls that once carried only whispers of shame. My son comes too, quieter, humbler. He still struggles to meet my gaze, but each time he repairs something in the house, each time he sits beside me in silence, I see the slow rebuilding of a bridge nearly burned to ashes. Forgiveness is not a gift I gave lightly, but it is one I chose. Not for him, but for me. Because to hold on to bitterness is to let betrayal keep living inside you, and I have banished it from these halls. The mistress remains locked away, her name spoken only as a warning. The lawyer, too, his career erased. They became footnotes in a story larger than themselves, a story not of greed but of dignity. People still write to me. Letters arrive weekly, sometimes daily. Women, men, even children write of their own battles, their own humiliations, their own quiet strength. Some tell me they stood up after hearing mine. Some say they left abusive homes or challenged relatives who tried to rob them of what was theirs. I keep every letter, stacked in boxes in the study, a testament to the ripple effect of one night when silence broke. And yet, in the quiet of evening, when the world settles and the garden outside breathes in the dusk, I think of him, my husband, not with love, not with hate, but with clarity. He was a man who chose weakness, who surrendered to threats instead of fighting for truth. He betrayed me in the end, but even in that betrayal, he left me the weapon to rise. The pocket watch still ticks on my nightstand. Sometimes I open it not to hear the recording anymore, but to listen to the steady heartbeat of time itself. It reminds me that survival is measured not in victories, but in moments when you refuse to break. People ask me often, do you regret what you did? Do you regret shattering the illusion of your family in such a public way? I answer them with the same words every time. No, I regret the years I stayed silent. I regret the nights I swallowed humiliation to keep the peace, but I do not regret the night I stood, because standing saved me. That is the truth I want you to hear, whoever you are, wherever you are. If you find yourself erased, humiliated, betrayed, you must understand, silence is not peace. Silence is the mask that abusers count on. And when you break it, when you let your voice rise, the world cannot remain the same. I have learned that dignity is not something others give you. It is not written in wills or carved into property deeds. Dignity is claimed, it is protected, it is fought for, and no betrayal, no humiliation, no lie has the power to erase it unless you let it. As I sit here, the candle flickering by the portrait of the man I once loved, I no longer see a woman abandoned. I see a woman reborn. My story began with humiliation in a church pew, but it ends here, with peace in my own home, with the knowledge that my scars are not signs of defeat, but of survival. And now I turn to you, listening to my voice. If betrayal came for you, if someone tried to erase your worth, would you break or would you rise? Would you surrender to silence or would you let silence shatter? Because this much I know, betrayal may burn, but dignity rises from ashes like fire. And sometimes the only way to save a relationship is to be willing to lose it. So tell me, if you were me, would you have had the courage to fight?